The White River moves differently at dawn. In the Missouri Ozarks, where the river drains south through Shannon and Ozark counties before crossing into Arkansas, the early morning light arrives in pieces. First a pale gray through the canopy, then a slow warming across the gravel bars. Then finally, the full low gold of a November sunrise, breaking over the ridge to the east and catching the water in a long flat shimmer between the tree lines. The river is clear in autumn, clear enough that the gravel bed shows through 4 feet of water in the shallows, pale limestone and dark chert arranged in the patterns the current has been sorting since long before anyone had a name for the drainage or the hills it ran through. The smell of the place in early morning is limestone and wet leaf litter, cold air coming off the water, and somewhere above it all, the faint dry scent of cedar coming down from the bluffs. A thing heard here in the dark would carry a long way. Sound moves through these hollows in ways that do not always follow the rules of flat country. It bends around bluffs, it rises and falls through gaps in the ridge. It arrives from one direction and seems to come from another entirely, so that a person standing on the gravel bar at the river's edge in the hour before sunrise might hear something from the opposite bank and be unable to say, afterward, with confidence, exactly where the sound had been. Missouri territorial records from the 1820s, ink on paper that has faded now to a pale tobacco brown, held in courthouse archives and in the collections of the Missouri Historical Society, include among their routine documentation of land claims, trade routes, and boundary disputes a smaller and less formal category of annotation. Depositions from fur trappers operating along the White River drainage in that decade describe in the plain and functional language of men making official statements encounters with an animal that did not correspond to anything in the regional inventory they carried with them into the hills. These men knew bears, they knew wolves, which had not yet been fully reduced from the Ozarks. They knew mountain lions, called painters in the vocabulary of the time, and they knew the sounds those animals made, the deep cough and grunt of a bear, at rest or disturbed, the particular rising scream of a mountain lion in the night, which is alarming enough even for people expecting it. What they described in these depositions was something else, a large dark animal, low to the ground, moving at a speed inconsistent with a bear's usual behavior, and rather than growling, it screamed. The depositions do not agree on every particular. They were made by different men in different seasons along different stretches of the drainage, but the screaming is consistent across them, and the speed, and the darkness of the animal in whatever light they had at the time of seeing it. One annotation survives in the margin of a hand-drawn land survey from a Missouri territorial courthouse, a survey of a portion of the White River watershed, its lines laid down in the careful draftsmanship of someone trained to mark the boundary between one claim and another with precision. The survey is a practical document. It records distances and directions and the names of natural features as the surveying party knew them. But beside the notation for a particular section of the White River drainage, in the narrow margin of the sheet, someone has written in a hand slightly different from the main survey text. Unknown large animal screams. Nothing more. No date for the observation, no name attached to it, just the notation, sitting in the margin, the way a detail sits when someone felt it needed to be recorded, but did not know under which heading it belonged. The ink of those words is brown now, like the rest of the document, almost indistinguishable from the field around it. It takes a moment to find them if you are not looking, but they are there. The Ozark Plateau occupies approximately 47,000 square miles of the interior of the continent, spreading across southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, northeastern Oklahoma, and the corner of southeastern Kansas. It is not a single mountain range in the conventional sense. It is an elevated plateau, ancient and heavily dissected by water, so that over millions of years, the rivers and their tributaries have carved the underlying limestone into a landscape of deep hollows, narrow ridgelines, sudden bluffs, and cave systems that run through the rock in passages no one has fully mapped. The terrain is karst, formed by the slow dissolution of soluble rock, by water working through the stone for longer than any human system of record keeping has existed, and it means the land here has an interior life. Springs emerge from cliff faces with no visible source. Streams disappear into the ground and re-emerge a quarter-mile away in a different hollow. The forest that covers the plateau is dense hardwood, oak and hickory, and maple along the ridges and upper slopes, cedar and sycamore and willow along the river bottoms. The canopy in summer so thick that moving through the forest at midday feels like moving through a dimly lit room, the light diffuse and cool, and coming from no single direction. Many communities across this terrain remained accessible only by foot or mule trail well into the 20th century. The road into a hollow might follow the creek bed in the hollow itself, which meant in high water the road became the creek, and a community at the upper end of a long drainage could be cut off from any contact with the wider world for days or weeks at a time. This was not remarkable to the people who lived there. It was the ordinary condition of the place. And in that ordinary condition, over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the knowledge of what lived in the surrounding forest was a practical matter rather than a taxonomic one. People knew the woods the way people know a place they have to survive in, not from books or catalogs, but from direct experience accumulated across generations and passed down in the particular currency of observation and story. The Osage Nation held ancestral territory across much of the Ozark Plateau, the river corridors, the elevated plains to the west and north of the most rugged hill country, the transition zones where the plateau broke down into the Arkansas River Valley. The Osage were among the most powerful nations of the interior continent, and their relationship to this landscape was deep and old. Their oral traditions carried accounts of spirit animals occupying the deep forest and the river bottoms, powerful presences, forces with intent, creatures that did not correspond cleanly to the bears or mountain lions or other animals Osage hunters encountered in their daily lives. These spirit animals occupied a different category of being. They were not unknown animals in the sense of waiting to be identified and classified. They were entities of a different order, assigned to specific territories and specific kinds of presence, and the appropriate response to encountering one was not to pursue it, but to acknowledge what kind of encounter was taking place. It is important to be careful here, and the Ouachita were dispossessed of their territory through a process of treaty violations, forced cession, and ultimately removal, a history that does not belong in the background of a story about folklore, but must be acknowledged plainly for what it was. The oral traditions that carried their understanding of this landscape and its inhabitants were the traditions of a people who had been separated from the land, those traditions described, and the separation was violent and politically enforced. And what survives of those traditions survives because Osage communities worked to preserve it under conditions that were not conducive to that preservation. The accounts of spirit animals in the deep forest are not folklore scenery. They are the recorded observations of people who knew this landscape as well as any humans who have ever lived in it, passed forward through a history that might have erased them. That they persist is itself something worth holding for a moment before moving on. The Scots-Irish families who began arriving in the Ozark Hollows in the early 19th century brought with them, along with their tools and seeds and livestock, a complete and well-developed tradition of monster folklore from the British Isles and the Appalachians. They had come through on their way west. This tradition was not naive. Folklorists examining the cultural origins of Ozark supernatural belief have documented in detail the way Scots-Irish, English, and German settlers carried specific creature archetypes into new territory and applied them to new landscapes, a process not of simple transplantation, but of active adaptation in which the creature brought from the old country became, over time, something shaped by the new place. The bear-cat hybrid, a large predatory animal combining the body and strength of a bear with the vocalizations and agility of a great cat, was a recurring archetype in this pre-existing tradition. It was not invented in the Ozarks, but arrived there with the settlers and found in the dark hollows and the limestone bluffs and the karst terrain full of echoes, a landscape that suited it. A Scots-Irish family's first winter in an Ozark hollow in the 1820s would have been a particular kind of experience. The cabin they built, or that had been built for them by a neighbor or a relation already settled in the hills, was a single-room structure with a fireplace at one end, a packed dirt floor, shuttered windows against the cold, and a door of split logs hung on leather hinges that was adequate against the wind, but not much else. The surrounding forest pressed close on all four sides. In winter, with the leaves down, a person standing inside the cabin and looking through the gaps in the shutters might see the tree trunks for 30 or 40 feet into the woods before the darkness closed around them. The sounds of the forest at night in those hills, the wind through the ridgetop trees, the creak of branches under ice, the occasional sudden movement of something large in the brush below the cabin, close enough to hear the leaves and sticks shifting under its weight. Those sounds were the ambient condition of survival in a new and unfamiliar landscape. In that context, a sound that could not be identified, a prolonged rising cry from the hollow below, unlike anything the family had heard in the Appalachians or the British Isles, would have been assigned to the category of things already known to make that kind of sound, or to the category of something that did not have a name yet. The second category was not comfortable. Vance Randolph arrived in the Ozarks some decades after the last of the pioneer generation had grown old, and he spent the better part of his adult life collecting what those years and the generations before them had produced. He was a prolific and serious folklorist, trained in the academic tradition, but committed above all to the material itself, the stories, the songs, the beliefs, the accumulated oral record of communities that had been largely outside the attention of mainstream American cultural documentation. His work across the mid-20th century produced a substantial archive of Ozark folk belief, including extensive documentation of what he classified broadly under monster lore. This category included accounts of large unidentified creatures in the Arkansas and Missouri Hill Country, accounts collected from living informants who had themselves experienced what they were describing, or who were repeating what a parent or grandparent had described to them with the particular authority of first-hand experience. Randolph did not assign a singular name to the creature that appeared in these accounts. In his time, the standardized label Ozark Howler had not yet coalesced into the form it would later take. What the accounts he collected shared was not a name, but a set of consistent physical and behavioral characteristics: the size, the sound, the darkness, the speed, and the consistent emotional response those characteristics produced in the people who encountered them. He recorded these accounts with the care of someone who understood that what a community believes about the non-human world tells you something essential about that community's relationship to the place it inhabits. The belief was the subject. The creature in the belief was the material the belief was made of. There is an image that comes from this period in the archive. Randolph seated at a wooden table in a Newton County kitchen in the early 1940s. A wire recorder running on the table beside him, the spools turning slowly. An elderly woman across from him, a woman who had lived her entire life in the hills, who had been born in a hollow not far from this kitchen, and who had spent the decades between that birth and this afternoon accumulating the kind of knowledge that only comes from sustained attention to a single place. She is describing, in a voice that Randolph's recording would have preserved in all its texture and specificity, a sound she heard from the hollow below her house the previous autumn, not the previous autumn of her youth, the autumn just past. The sound had come from the hollow below the house, she said, and she had heard it before, heard versions of it, heard her father describe it, heard her husband say once that he had heard it on the ridge above the creek one morning before dawn, and had not been sure for several minutes what it was. What she described to Randolph was not performed. It was reported. It was the account of a careful observer of the natural world, someone who had spent a lifetime distinguishing between known and unknown sounds in that particular acoustic environment, describing something she had not been able to assign to a known category. Randolph recorded it. He filed it. He noted the consistency with other accounts from other hollows and other counties, and then he moved on to the next interview. The White River drainage, where those first depositions were made in the 1820s, is part of a much larger hydrological system that organizes the entire Ozark Plateau. The rivers here run in the limestone, the Current, the Jack's Fork, the 11 Point, the Buffalo, the Kings, each one cutting its corridor through the karst over millions of years, each one creating, in the process, a particular kind of habitat. River bottoms with their dense canopy of sycamore and cottonwood, bluff lines with their talus slopes and cave openings, the transition zones between the upland forest and the river corridor where deer and turkey and bear move between feeding and cover. In all of this terrain, at all of these transition zones, the acoustic properties of the hollow and the bluff and the river bend do the same thing they have always done. They carry sound. They amplify certain frequencies. They route a call made on one bank so that it appears to come from a point somewhere to the left of the source, or above it, or from behind the listener. A person standing on a gravel bar at dawn, along the White River, or the Current River, or the Buffalo River, hearing something call from somewhere in the tree line, might turn their head 3 times before arriving at a direction that felt right, and even then the source would be in the dark. The mule trail between 2 Ozark ridgelines at dusk in the 1830s was a particular kind of place. The trail itself, cut by mule hooves and wagon wheels and foot traffic through the decades, worn into the soft limestone substrate to a depth of several inches in the steeper stretches, moved through the forest in a narrow corridor of slightly more light than the surrounding trees allowed. At dusk, that corridor of light narrowed further as the sky above the canopy shifted from orange to gray to dark. A traveler on that trail at dusk was passing through a space where the available light came primarily from the sky overhead, visible as strips between the treetops, and where the forest on both sides reduced visibility to a few yards in any direction. Sounds carried well in that corridor, the mule's footfalls, the creak of a saddle, the distant sound of water somewhere to the left, and other sounds, the sounds that had been in these hills long before the trail was cut through them, long before the first settler arrived in the hollow below to the south, long before any European system of documentation had turned its attention to what lived in the Ozark Karst. The German settlers who arrived in the hill country alongside the Scots-Irish carried their own tradition of forest-dwelling supernatural creatures, creatures that occupied the deep woods and made sounds that indicated something neither entirely natural nor entirely beyond nature. The English settlers carried the black dog, the barghest, the creature of hedge and moor that translates poorly to a landscape without hedges or moors, but finds in the dense hardwood hollow something that serves the same atmospheric function. These traditions did not remain separate. They mixed in the way that traditions mix when communities share a landscape, and the stories they tell about that landscape begin to address the same observations from different starting points. By the mid-19th century, the accounts coming out of the Ozark Hill communities were already a hybrid, the way the communities themselves were a hybrid, Scots, Irish, and English, and German, and the occasional French trapper's influence, all of it filtered through the specific conditions of a place that had already been shaped by 10,000 years of indigenous presence. What is consistent across all of these threads? The Osage oral tradition, the Scots-Irish bear-cat archetype, the English forest creature, the German wood spirit, the depositions of fur trappers making formal statements about what they had encountered along the White River, is that they converge on the same qualities. Something large and dark in the deep forest, something that moved faster than a bear was expected to move, something that screamed rather than growled, and whose scream was sustained and rising and unlike anything in the regional inventory of known animal sounds. Each tradition arrived at this description from a different cultural starting point. The place itself may have provided the raw material they were all working with. By the latter half of the 19th century, the accounts were well enough established in the Ozark Hill communities that they were no longer remarkable as individual reports. They had become part of the texture of the landscape. In the same way that a community living near a particular stretch of river knows which bends flood in spring and which do not, which rock faces are unstable and which have been solid for a generation, Ozark Hill communities knew which hollows and which ridgelines had histories of unusual encounters. They knew which old-timers had heard the sound. They knew which hunting dogs had refused to follow a track into a particular stand of timber. This knowledge was not written down in any official record. It was carried in the ordinary conversation of people who shared a landscape, and it was transmitted across generations the way all practical knowledge is transmitted, in the context of use, when the knowledge was relevant, when someone was about to go into the hollow and needed to know what the hollow had been known to hold. The name Ozark Howler, the standardized label by which the creature is known today in the broader record of American cryptid lore, did not emerge from those communities. It was applied later as the legend moved outward from the hill country into print journalism and eventually into the wider cultural circulation of paranormal accounts. The names the communities themselves used were local names attached to specific hollows and specific experiences. There was the screamer, used by some families in the White River country. There was the cat bear, the bear-cat hybrid archetype given a local compound name. There was the dark thing on the ridge, which appears in at least one account collected from a Shannon County family in the early 20th century. And there was a name that appears in several of the earliest documented oral history accounts from multiple communities across the hill country. A name so simple and so precisely descriptive that it requires no elaboration, no embellishment, no cultural translation from one tradition to another. The thing in the hollow. That phrase sits in the record, the way the marginal notation on the White River survey sits in its margin, plain, unelaborated, made by someone who needed a name for something that did not yet have one, and chose the most accurate words available. The hollow is a specific geographic feature of this terrain. Every community in the Ozark Hill Country has its hollows, the valleys carved by the smaller streams and their tributaries, the low places between ridge lines where the water collects and the darkness gathers, and the acoustic conditions do what they always do. The thing that lives in the hollow is not a generalized monster. It is located, it is specific to a place, and the communities across these mountains who used that name, or names that functioned in the same way, were not sharing a single tradition or drawing from a single source. They were arriving independently from their separate hollows and their separate histories at the same description of something they believed was there, whether what they were describing was a single unknown creature or a known creature heard under conditions that altered its apparent qualities, or the projection of deep cultural archetypes onto a landscape that invited projection, or some combination of all of these. The question remains open. The depositions from the 1820s do not resolve it. The wire recordings Randolph made in the 1940s do not resolve it. The name in the margin of the survey does not resolve it. What they establish is simpler and in some ways more interesting. Communities across nearly 200 years of contact with this landscape, coming from different cultures and different starting points and different ways of knowing the world, were naming something. The thing in the hollow. That name had been in circulation for a long time before anyone tried to settle on what it meant. In the last of the light on a late November evening in 1973, near the logging road that cuts through the Boston Mountains south of Leslie, Arkansas, a group of deer hunters came to a stop at the edge of a gravel surface and stood without speaking for a long moment. Their flashlight beams crossed the road and came to rest on the soft shoulder on the far side where the ground was still disturbed, gravel pushed to one side, the damp earth beneath showing an impression deep enough and wide enough that none of the men offered an identification. The disturbance was fresh. Whatever had made it had crossed the road recently enough that the gravel had not yet settled. One of the hunters moved the flashlight beam slowly along the tree line and then along the road in both directions, and the road was empty in both directions, and the forest beyond the beam's reach was quiet. The accounts from that evening, collected separately from the 3 witnesses present, agree on the impression's size, on the freshness of the disturbance, and on the fact that none of them felt comfortable naming what had made it. That collective pause, the moment of standing at the edge of a logging road with a flashlight and an unmarked impression in the mud, sits at the center of a long record of similar moments distributed across the Ozark and Ouachita Hill Country over more than a century. The reports come from deer hunters and night fishermen, from farmers checking fence lines before dawn, from park visitors and local landowners and Forest Service workers. They do not all describe the same thing in identical terms. What they share across accounts separated by decades and county lines, and the ordinary variation in how people notice and describe and remember, is a consistent cluster of physical characteristics, a body type, a quality of movement, a track, a sound that sets the described animal apart from the documented fauna of the region in ways that witnesses return to again and again when their accounts are collected. The body, in the most frequently cited reports, is low and heavy. The consistent picture across sighting accounts from Arkansas and Missouri places the animal's shoulder height at roughly 3 to 4 feet from the ground, higher than a large domestic dog, lower than an adult black bear standing on all fours. The length from chest to hindquarters, where witnesses attempted to estimate it, tends toward 5 to 7 feet, with accounts noting a particular massiveness to the animal's chest and neck that differentiated it in the observer's mind from anything they had seen before. That neck is one of the most repeated details in the descriptive record. Multiple unrelated accounts, filed across different decades and different counties, make specific note of it. A thickness and musculature around the neck and shoulders disproportionate to what witnesses associated with either a bear or a mountain lion. A bear carries its mass across its back and haunches. A mountain lion carries itself long and lean, its neck relatively slight. What witnesses in the Howler accounts described was something that seemed to carry its weight forward, concentrated in the chest and neck in a way that made the animal look, in the words of one collected account from Shannon County, Missouri, as though it had been built for a different kind of force than any animal the witness could name. The fur presents its own pattern in the record. Accounts from both Arkansas and Missouri are consistent on one point that becomes striking only when the reports are read against the regional fauna. The coat is described as long and shaggy, not the short, dense fur of a mountain lion, which lies flat against the body and catches light cleanly, not quite the thick winter coat of a black bear, though it is to that description that the howler's fur comes closest in most accounts. Several witnesses use the word shaggy without prompting, arriving at the same term independently to describe a coat that seemed to hang from the animal's body rather than cover it closely. A subset of reports adds a color note that appears too consistently to be dismissed as coincidence in the collected record, a reddish-brown tinge visible along the flanks or shoulders when the animal was seen in direct light. Not all accounts include this detail. Many describe only dark fur or dark fur with no color assessment offered, but the reddish note appears across enough separate, unrelated accounts to constitute a recurring feature of the descriptive record, whether or not the feature points toward a single animal or a pattern of observation or something else entirely. The account from a farm in Newton County, Arkansas, from the early 1990s describes this quality of light on the animal's coat in detail that is worth sitting with. The witness, a man who had farmed that land for over 30 years and was not, by his own account in the collected interview, someone who frightened easily or talked loosely about what he saw, described watching an animal cross the far edge of his pasture in the middle of a clear October morning. The sun was low enough that it came in at an angle across the field, and when the animal moved through that angled light, there was a brief moment when the fur along its shoulder caught the light from the side and showed a warmth of color that the witness described as closer to rust than brown. The animal did not pause. It crossed the edge of the field in perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, moving into the timber at a pace the witness described as unhurried, but covering ground faster than he would have expected for its size. He did not go after it. He stood in the middle of the pasture and watched the tree line until he was satisfied nothing was going to come back out of it, and then he went in and wrote down what he had seen. The physical evidence that accumulated around Howler reports across the documented record takes 2 primary forms. The first is track evidence. Plaster casts attributed to Howler activity, documented in a small number of cases from both Arkansas and Missouri, show prints measuring between 4 and 6 inches across, with 5 toe impressions pressed to a depth in soft soil, consistent with an animal weighing several hundred pounds. A cast of this description, made in Newton County and examined by wildlife biologists, sits in a photograph on a wooden workbench, its edges slightly crumbled where the substrate began to give before the plaster fully set, a small imperfection that tells its own story about the conditions under which the evidence was gathered, in the field, in uncertain light, with materials that do not always cooperate. Wildlife biologists who examined the documented casts in the most formally recorded cases attributed them to black bear tracks altered by substrate conditions, mud soft enough, or wet enough, or subject to enough ground pressure over time to distort the original dimensions of the print and blur the sharp delineation between toes. That explanation is straightforward and well supported in the general literature on wildlife track identification. It does not resolve every account. In at least one documented instance, in the cast's five-toe impression and the depth of the print were noted in the biologist's own field report as presenting characteristics that the black bear attribution, while most probable, did not fully account for, and that notation remains in the record alongside the attribution itself. The second form of physical evidence is claw marks. Reports of claw marks on tree bark and fence posts from areas of documented howler activity place the highest marks at between 5 and 7 feet from the ground. The description of these marks in the accounts is specific, deep parallel gouges, consistent with claws rather than with the rubbing or scraping that bears and deer produce on trees during normal seasonal behavior. Local hunters and wildlife workers who examined the marks in several documented cases noted the spacing and depth as not easily accounted for by the standard reach and force of either a black bear or a mountain lion. A fence post at the edge of a Newton County pasture, cedar, weathered gray, standing at the corner of a field, bore 3 parallel gouges, beginning at a height just above the shoulder of a tall person and angling downward, the exposed wood pale and clean. The depth of the cuts was noted in the account as greater than anything the examining witness, a man with long experience of bear country, had seen a black bear produce on a similar surface. That assessment is the witness's own, offered carefully and without elaboration, and it sits in the record as what it is, one experienced person's considered observation, neither more nor less than that. The hair evidence is slimmer. A few accounts describe fur caught on barbed wire in areas of reported activity, coarse, dark, 3 or 4 inches long, moving in an early morning breeze against the stillness of an empty field. Samples of this kind, where they were collected and submitted for analysis, returned identifications consistent with known regional species. White-tailed deer, black bear. In one case, domestic dog. The hair caught on the barbed wire. Whatever it looked like when it was found, and whoever found it, did not survive analysis as evidence of something outside the documented fauna. That outcome does not settle the broader record. It settles the question of those specific samples, which is a narrower question than it might appear. There is a researcher's field notebook documented in the archive of one of the more careful collectors of howler accounts that has appeared in descriptions of the primary source material often enough to have become something of an emblematic object within the record. The notebook is open in those descriptions to a page of handwritten measurements, shoulder height estimates, track dimensions, vocalization duration in seconds, the heights of claw marks above ground level, the entries made in a neat, careful hand. The margin beside one entry reads, "Cannot assign to known species with confidence," not "cannot assign to any species," not evidence of an unknown animal, simply "cannot assign to known species with confidence." That notation, sitting in the margin of a carefully maintained field notebook alongside specific measurements collected in good faith over a period of years, captures something true about the state of the physical evidence record. It is a record full of specific measurements and specific impressions and specific field assessments, and it arrives again and again at the same honest edge, close to something, not quite at it. The vocalization is where the documented record becomes most consistent and most resistant to brief summary. Witnesses describing the howler's call across decades and counties, and the ordinary differences in how people hear and remember sound arrive at a profile with enough shared characteristics to constitute a pattern rather than a coincidence of description. The sound begins low. Multiple accounts, independently gathered, use the word rumble or something close to it, a low, resonant note with enough physical presence that witnesses describe feeling it as much as hearing it. From that low beginning, the call rises. The rise is sustained over several seconds, moving through registers that witnesses struggle to find language for, arriving finally at a high pitch that some accounts place close to a scream and others describe as something between a howl and a cry. The full duration of a single call, as estimated by witnesses and noted in the collected record, runs between 3 and 8 seconds. That range is wide enough to suggest genuine variation in what was heard or in how people assess duration in moments of acute attention, or both. What does not vary across the accounts is the structural description: low beginning, sustained rise, high terminus, a quality of length and resonance that exceeds what witnesses associated with any call they had previously heard from a known animal. The consistency of the fear response in the accounts is itself a piece of data worth holding carefully. Witnesses across the record, including people with long experience of the Ozark woods and documented familiarity with the full range of sounds that coyotes, foxes, bobcats, screech owls, and black bears are capable of producing, describe their response to the howler's call in terms that go beyond recognition. Not the identified but alarming quality of hearing a bobcat's territorial scream for the first time. Something less classifiable than that, a quality of response described by one Shannon County witness as immediate and physical, not processed through any assessment of what had produced it, preceding any attempt at identification. Another account, from a night hunter along the current river, uses the phrase "didn't think to run, just ran," and then corrects itself, "didn't run, but couldn't say afterward that the impulse hadn't been there." These are not accounts by frightened or inexperienced people reporting a thing they didn't understand. Several of the witnesses who describe this quality of response also state plainly that they cannot identify what produced it, and the precision of that distinction, cannot identify, rather than was terrified by something unknown, marks the difference between honest testimony and narrative performance. The acoustic properties of Ozark terrain contribute a layer of complication to any attempt to interpret the vocalization accounts on a strictly geographic basis. Ozark hollows, formed where limestone ridgelines drop into river corridors and creek drainages, produce acoustic conditions documented well enough in regional field ecology to be treated as a known property of the landscape. Sound entering a hollow from above or from the far end travels along the walls of the terrain, feature in ways that can make a call seem to come from multiple directions simultaneously, or from no specific direction, or from a point much closer than the source's actual position. Witnesses consistently noted, across the documented vocalization accounts, that they could not identify a single direction from which the call originated. Some described it as surrounding them. Others placed it first in one direction and then revised the estimate as the sound continued. This is a documented property of Ozark acoustic geography. It is not a mystery of the call itself. A black bear producing a stress vocalization in the mouth of a hollow above a river corridor would, under the right atmospheric conditions and the right terrain geometry, sound to a listener in the valley below like something filling the hollow from all sides at once. That context does not reduce the accounts, it adds a dimension to them. The witnesses were not mishearing or misremembering the direction of the sound. The landscape was doing what the landscape does, and they were reporting their accurate experience of it. What the acoustic geography cannot explain is whether the sound's source was a known animal producing an unusual vocalization under unusual circumstances, or something the regional fauna record does not fully account for, or a known animal producing a known vocalization that the hollow's geometry amplified and distorted past the point of recognition. Those three possibilities exist in the record simultaneously and have not been formally resolved. The 1973 accounts from Leslie, Arkansas, are useful here not because they stand above the rest of the record in evidentiary weight, but because they represent one of the most completely documented multi-witness events in the collected material. 3 hunters, examined separately, produced accounts that aligned on the physical impression on the road's shoulder, on the direction of travel the disturbance indicated, on the approximate freshness of the tracks, and on the absence of any other physical evidence in the immediate vicinity. The alignment of their accounts across separate collection is one of the things that places this incident near the center of the documentary record. No recording was made. No physical material was formally collected that night. What survives is the consistent alignment of 3 independent accounts of 3 Despentillibets held in the file of the researcher who gathered them, describing a specific physical location on a specific evening and a specific quality of uncertainty that all 3 witnesses arrived at independently and expressed in different words as the same thing. An account from a night fisherman along the Buffalo River, documented in the 1990s, adds a detail to the vocalization record that a number of collectors of howler material have noted. The witness was camped on a gravel bar in Newton County, alone, on a clear night in early October. He had fished that stretch of the river many times over 20 years and knew the sounds of the corridor well. Sometime after midnight, he heard a sound from the bluffs above the far bank that he first took for a coyote in some distress, then revised that identification as the call continued and the pitch and duration exceeded anything in his experience of coyotes, and then abandoned any identification attempt entirely and simply listened. The call occurred 3 times, he said, at intervals of several minutes, each time from the same general direction above the bluffs, but seeming, by the 3rd iteration, to come from slightly further upstream. He made no attempt to investigate. He sat by the water until the sound did not recur, and then he sat for some time longer. When he wrote his account down, which he did the following morning in the notebook he kept for fishing records, he noted the time, the location, the temperature, and the duration of the 3 calls, and then noted that he had been fishing the Buffalo River for 20 years and had heard a great many things in those corridors and had never heard that. That account survives in the collected record because he reported it to a researcher who found him through the Buffalo River Outfitters Network, and it is one of many similar accounts attached to that particular stretch of river. It is consistent with them, it adds to them, it does not resolve them. The physical picture across the record, held whole rather than assembled from any single piece of evidence, produces an image that is specific enough to describe but not specific enough to identify with certainty. A heavy, low-slung animal, a shaggy coat, dark, with possible reddish warmth along the flanks, a neck and chest massively built, a call that begins low and rises, lasting several seconds, producing in experienced witnesses a fear response they describe as prior to thought, tracks of a size and depth consistent with a large heavy animal, assessed in documented cases as most probably bear-derived, but not uniformly satisfying to the wildlife workers who examined them, claw marks at heights that hunters and farmers in the region found difficult to attribute to the known local fauna with complete confidence. Hair samples that, where analyzed, returned identifications consistent with known species. That picture does not resolve cleanly into a confirmed unknown animal. It does not resolve cleanly into a simple case of misidentified black bears, either, though the black bear remains the most frequently cited candidate explanation among wildlife researchers who have engaged with the documented record. The picture is the picture, a set of accumulated specific details gathered over a long period from a large number of people across a wide area that agrees on enough to constitute a pattern and leaves enough unaccounted for to remain genuinely open as a question. A researcher who spent several years assembling the most comprehensive collection of howler accounts available in the documented record noted in the preface to that collection that the body of evidence she worked from was notable not for its spectacular outliers, but for the quality of its central mass, the large number of ordinary, careful, specific accounts from people who were not seeking attention and whose descriptions, when laid side by side, showed a convergence on physical details that independent fabrication could not easily account for. She did not conclude from that convergence that an unknown species inhabited the Ozark Hill Country. She concluded that the convergence was real and that the question of what produced it was a legitimate one. That is where the physical evidence record rests, at a convergence whose source has not been formally determined. The sound of the howler's call in the documented descriptions does not leave a witness where it found them. Several accounts note that the effect of the call persisted after it ended, a quality of acoustic presence that the silence following it only made louder by contrast. The hollow that held the sound did not give back silence cleanly once the call stopped. It gave back the memory of the sound, held in the darkness and the still air for long enough that some witnesses reported uncertainty afterward about when exactly the call had ended and the silence had begun. That is not a supernatural observation. It is a straightforward description of how sound and memory work together in the dark, in a deep hollow, when something has produced a call outside the range of the listener's prior experience. The silence that follows an unexpected and unidentified sound carries a particular quality. It occupies the air for a while. It moves across hollow and bluff and river bar, carrying the shape of what produced it, present in the landscape for a moment longer than the sound itself, then fading into the background noise of moving water and wind in the canopy, and the general unattended life of the forest, going on in every direction, at every hour, whether anyone in the hollow is listening or not. The Buffalo River at Steel Creek runs shallow in October. The gravel bars that emerge when the water drops are pale limestone, smoothed over centuries into something that looks almost white in the afternoon light, and the river itself moves over them in long, clear sheets, thin enough in places to read the bottom stone by stone. The sandstone bluffs on the far bank rise perhaps 200 feet above the waterline, and in October, in the last hour of afternoon, the light catches them at a low angle that turns the rock from gray to a deep, warm orange that holds until the sun clears the ridge and then goes out all at once. The forest above those bluffs begins immediately at the edge. No transition, no clearing, just the dense overstory of oak and hickory running back from the bluff rim into the interior of Newton County for miles without a significant break. Anything standing at the bluff edge would be visible from the river below. Anything stepping back a single pace into that tree line would not. This particular stretch of the Buffalo River, the corridor running between Steel Creek and Kyle's Landing, a distance of roughly 11 miles, through one of the most intact limestone canyon landscapes in the central United States, appears in Ozark Howler sighting reports from at least 4 separate decades: the 1940s, the 1970s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. Each cluster of accounts comes from witnesses with no apparent connection to one another, arriving at this stretch of river in different seasons and different circumstances, and each cluster shares enough physical and behavioral detail with the others to make the geographic concentration one of the most consistent and specific patterns in the documented Howler record. The accounts are not identical. They differ in the distance between the witness and whatever was reported, in the duration of the observation, in whether the experience was primarily visual or primarily auditory. What they share is the location, this particular bend of river, this particular arrangement of bluff and forest and hollow, and the particular quality of attention that witnesses describe bringing to whatever they encountered here, the sense of something that required them to stop and listen and look more carefully than they had been looking before. The Steel Creek area itself sits within the Buffalo National River, established in 1972 as the first national river in the United States, which preserved the corridor from the dam projects that had been proposed for it over the preceding decades. The preservation of that corridor meant the preservation of a particular kind of ecological continuity: forest that had not been cleared, river bottom that had not been channeled, bluff-line terrain that remained structurally similar to what it had been when the earliest accounts in the record were made. The wildlife documentation from within the national river boundary confirms healthy populations of black bear, white-tailed deer, bobcat, and wild turkey, with confirmed mountain lion sightings from trail cameras within or adjacent to the corridor in multiple years of the 21st century. The biological context for a large animal moving through this landscape at night is, in other words, well established. What the biological context does not resolve is why this particular stretch of river accumulates accounts with the consistency it does, across time periods far enough apart that no single animal's range or lifespan would bridge them. Among the documented site clusters in the Howler record, the Buffalo River corridor is probably the most thoroughly cross-referenced. The current river corridor in Shannon and Carter counties, Missouri, offers something different, a wider and more diffuse pattern distributed across a longer time frame, but rooted in terrain that functions as the Ozark interior at its most ecologically intact. Shannon and Carter counties together contain some of the lowest population densities of any counties in Missouri, and the terrain they hold is a consequence of that low density, a landscape that never produced enough agricultural return to justify the clearing that reshaped most of the Midwest, and so remained in its largely forested condition through the 20th century and into the present. The current river runs through this landscape in long, clear, spring-fed pools connected by gravel bar riffles, cold enough even in late summer that the water is visibly different in color from ordinary river water, a particular shade of blue-green that comes from the high mineral content of the limestone aquifer it draws from. The corridor along the current was established as the Ozark National Scenic Riverways in 1964, making it one of the first protected river systems in the country, and the administrative files from that park unit contain informal records of unusual animal reports going back to its early decades of operation. The Ozark National Scenic Riverways administrative files are not a cryptozoological database. They are the accumulated operational records of a federal park unit, visitor incident reports, ranger field notes, wildlife inventory records, correspondence with regional resource agencies. Within those files, spread across decades of routine record keeping, there are entries describing unusual animal reports from park visitors and from local landowners along the river corridor whose families had been in the area for generations. The reports are not sensational in their framing. They are the kind of notation a park ranger makes when a visitor describes something they cannot account for. Brief, matter of fact, filed and retained without resolution. Across a significant number of those entries, the physical and behavioral characteristics described align with what the broader Howler account record documents: a large, low, dark-colored animal, a vocalization that did not match what the witness expected from known regional species, a track or disturbance in soft ground that left the observer uncertain about attribution. The Shannon and Carter County area also holds Greer Spring, which emerges from a cave mouth in Oregon County at a volume that makes it the second largest spring in Missouri by discharge, more than 200 million gallons per day, flowing out of the bluff face and down a short branch into the 11-Point River. The sound of that volume of water filling the hollow around it is complete. It is not a background sound. It is the entire acoustic environment of the hollow, leaving no sonic space for anything else except in the brief, irregular gaps between surge pulses. Local accounts from this area frequently note that the acoustic conditions around Greer Spring and the spring-fed hollows along the current river create a particular uncertainty about the origin and nature of sounds heard at night, sounds that in other terrain might be easily located by direction and distance, but that here reflect off bluff walls, travel down hollow corridors, and arrive at the listener from angles that do not correspond to where the source actually is. This is not a mysterious property of the landscape. It is a well-understood characteristic of acoustic propagation in limestone canyon terrain. It is also, notably, a characteristic that the Howler sighting record consistently reflects. Witness accounts from this corridor repeatedly describe a vocalization whose apparent origin shifted or proved impossible to fix. A campfire built at a primitive site along the current river at 2 in the morning reaches perhaps 30 feet into the surrounding forest before the darkness takes over completely. The edge of the firelight is not a gradual fade. It is a reasonably distinct boundary, beyond which the dark is total, and the sounds of the forest, the water, the wind through the canopy, whatever is moving through the leaf litter, arrive without visual context. Witnesses who report Howler-type encounters from overnight camp positions along the current river corridor consistently describe exactly this configuration: the campfire, the 30 feet of illuminated ground, the darkness beyond, and then sound, not necessarily close, not necessarily identifiable, but present in a way that held their attention until the fire burned low. The Winding Stair Mountain National Recreation Area in LaFleur County, Oklahoma, occupies the southwestern corner of the Howler's documented range, and the sighting cluster that accumulated there in the 1980s and 1990s has a specific quality that sets it apart from the Buffalo River and Current River accounts. Most of the reported encounters in this cluster were primarily auditory rather than visual, witnesses describing their experiences from the Winding Stair ridgelines, hunters, campers, and in several cases people driving the Talamena Scenic Drive after dark, consistently report the same initial attribution: coyote. The sound begins in a register and at a scale consistent with coyote vocalization, which is a familiar and expected nighttime sound throughout the Ouachita uplands. The witness hears it, assigns it, and continues with what they were doing. Then the sound continues, and continues past the point where a coyote call would typically resolve, and the volume increases, and the pitch climbs past the upper range of what any local coyote chorus produces, and holds there in a sustained register that multiple witnesses across independent accounts describe as occupying a frequency range they had not previously encountered from any animal they could identify. The Talamina Scenic Drive follows the ridge tops of the winding stair and rich mountains along the Oklahoma-Arkansas border, and at night the road is entirely empty for long stretches. The forest falls away steeply on both sides, the canopy dropping into the hollows below the ridge, and the sky above the road is wide and dark. Sound in this position carries clearly downslope in both directions. A coyote calling from a hollow below the south face of the ridge would be clearly audible from the ridgeline road. Something calling from the north-facing hollow would be equally audible. What the ridgeline position makes difficult is determining which hollow a sound is coming from, or whether it is coming from a hollow at all. The acoustic reflection off the opposite ridge face can produce apparent sources in directions inconsistent with the actual emission point. Witnesses reporting from Talamina Drive positions in this period describe hearing what they believe to be a sustained, high-volume vocalization for durations between 3 and 6 minutes, with the apparent source shifting between calls in a way they could not account for. In most documented cases, they attributed the shift to their own uncertainty about the terrain, rather than to any movement of the animal. A coyote calling once from somewhere below the Talamina ridgeline and then going silent leaves a particular kind of quiet behind it. The absence of the sound is itself a presence. The ear continues attending to the space where the sound had been, waiting for the next call, registering the non-occurrence of what it expects. Several witnesses from the winding stair cluster describe this dynamic explicitly. Not the sound itself as the most significant moment, but the silence immediately following the longest vocalization of the sequence, a silence that lasted long enough that the witness began to feel the specific uncertainty of not knowing whether the sound had concluded or merely paused. The behavioral patterns reported across these geographic clusters carry a consistency that researchers examining the accounts have noted without arriving at settled explanations for. Across the Buffalo River, Current River, and winding stair clusters, and in scattered accounts from the broader Ozark region, night hunters in particular report an unusual tolerance in the animal they describe for proximity to illuminated positions. Multiple accounts collected from Arkansas and Missouri night hunters document what they describe as sustained observation, something large remaining visible at the edge of a flashlight or lantern beam 50 to 100 yards from the hunter's position for minutes at a time before withdrawing. The withdrawal is described consistently as deliberate rather than panicked, a movement back into deeper cover that matched the pace of normal travel rather than the explosive reaction associated with a deer, a turkey, or a startled black bear. Wildlife researchers examining this behavioral pattern have offered a straightforward assessment of it: a black bear that has become habituated to human presence through proximity to settled areas, through regular contact with campsites and food sources, through generations of reduced hunting pressure in protected land, develops a tolerance for human proximity and artificial light that an unhunted backcountry bear does not have. The Current River Corridor and the Buffalo National River both support populations of bears with significant exposure to the park-using public. A habituated bear approaching a campsite or investigating the perimeter of a night hunter's stand would, in most documented cases, do exactly what the Howler accounts describe: remain at the edge of illumination, attend to the position, and withdraw when the threat assessment resolved. This is not remarkable bear behavior. It is simply bear behavior in the context of reduced fear response, and it presents to the observer at night, in the dark, at the edge of a circle of light, with a quality that the available animal large, low-slung, dark-furred, does not immediately resolve into its known category. The accounts from each of these locations continue to accumulate. New reports from the Buffalo River corridor appear in online natural history forums, in casual conversation at ranger stations, in the notebooks of amateur naturalists who keep records of unusual observations. The current river corridor generates accounts at a similar low but persistent rate. Not a flood of reports, but a steady trickle of entries that keeps the record from going cold in any decade. The Winding Stair area remains less actively documented, partly because the Oklahoma portions of the Howler Range receive less systematic attention from researchers focused on the Arkansas and Missouri clusters, and partly because the reports themselves are harder to follow up. When most of the witnesses were passing through on a scenic drive, rather than living within the landscape that generated the account, there are other locations in the documented record that carry a different quality from the major clusters. Locations where the accumulation of accounts does not result from continuous community reporting across decades, but from something more specific, a community relationship with a particular site that frames unusual encounters there, as expected rather than anomalous. The area surrounding Alum Cove Natural Bridge in Madison County, Arkansas, is one of these. Alum Cove Natural Bridge is a sandstone arch formation in the Ozark National Forest, a geological structure that has drawn visitors since the 19th century and that sits within a landscape of deep hollow and thick forest typical of the Boston Mountains region. The accounts from this area do not read as a continuous cluster in the way the Steel Creek reports do. They read instead as occasional confirmations of an expectation, reports made by people who were not surprised to have had an unusual experience in this particular hollow, because the community memory of the area already included unusual experiences going back as far as anyone could reconstruct. Local residents near Alum Cove, when asked about howler accounts from this area, tend to describe the hollow as a place where such encounters have always been considered probable. Not certain, not regular, but probable, the way certain stretches of river are considered reliable for particular species of fish, not guaranteed but significantly more likely than a random stretch would produce. The community framing around Alum Cove has a different texture from the individual witness accounts that populate most of the howler record. It is collective rather than personal. It locates the unusual encounter not in a specific observation by a specific witness on a specific night, but in a shared understanding of the landscape that predates any particular report and continues regardless of whether any particular report is made. This kind of localized consensus about where unusual things happen is not unique to the howler legend or to the Ozarks. Folklorists documenting landscape-based oral tradition across a wide range of cultures identify it as a common feature of communities with long and intimate relationships with specific terrain, the emergence over time of a shared map of probability, assigning to certain features of the land a status as places where the ordinary and the unusual meet more often than elsewhere. Greer Spring in Oregon County, Missouri, carries a similar quality, though the community relationship with it is inflected by the landscape feature itself rather than by any particular howler account. The spring is large enough, and the hollow it occupies acoustically complete enough that local residents over generations have developed a specific relationship with its sound environment. The volume of water coming out of that cave mouth fills the hollow so completely that conversation becomes difficult at close range. Anything moving on the far bank of the spring branch would be heard only in the intervals between surge pulses, glimpses of sound in the acoustic gaps, arriving without enough context to be confidently identified. Long-term residents of this area describe the spring as a place that demands a particular kind of attentiveness, a recalibration of sensory expectation that makes the ordinary and the unusual harder to separate than they are in less acoustically demanding terrain. In this context, accounts of unusual sound experiences from Greer Spring and the surrounding hollow read differently from accounts generated in open terrain, not less credible, but placed in a richer set of physical conditions that expand the range of possible explanations rather than narrowing it. The hand-drawn map that a cryptozoological researcher might carry in a field binder, its Ozark counties outlined in pencil with small circled X marks at Steel Creek and Kyle's Landing and Alum Cove, its decade notations written in different ink colors as new accounts accumulated and were added to the existing pattern, is a document that does not resolve the question it represents. It is a record of accumulation. Each circle on that map is a place where something was reported, and the fact that multiple circles appear in some locations, the same stretch of river, the same hollow, the same ridgeline corridor, is a pattern that the map records faithfully without explaining. The map does not argue for the creature's existence. It simply shows where the accounts have been coming from across the decades during which anyone was collecting them. What the geographic pattern of the Howler account record reflects, at the level of the landscape rather than the legend, is the persistence of a particular kind of terrain across the Ozark and Ouachita uplands, terrain that has not been uniformly settled, cleared, or logged into a condition that eliminates the ecological and acoustic conditions that produce uncertain encounters between humans and large animals at night. The Buffalo River corridor survives because the National River designation protected it from the dams that would have changed it. The current river corridor survives because the thin soil and the rugged terrain made sustained agriculture prohibitive. The winding stair ridgelines survive as national forest land, their timber harvested selectively, but their overall structure preserved. What all of these places share beyond the Howler accounts that have been reported from them is the quality of ecological continuity that makes large nocturnal animals part of the landscape rather than refugees from it. A wildlife camera mounted on a cedar post along the current river records, over the course of a year, black bears in spring and fall moving through the corridor with the same quiet purposefulness that every large mammal brings to efficient nighttime travel. The camera image is infrared, grayscale, time-stamped, stripped of atmospheric interpretation. The bear moving through the frame at 3 in the morning is a documented animal in a documented landscape, and the documentation is clear and unambiguous. The same landscape, in the same season, heard rather than seen, from a position 50 yards from a campfire at the edge of its light, is something different, not because the animal has changed, but because the conditions of perception have changed. And the acoustic and visual information available to the observer at the campfire is not the same information available to the infrared camera mounted at ground level on the cedar post. The site-specific quality of the Howler's documented range, the way the accounts return, decade after decade, to the same stretches of river and the same ridgeline positions and the same hollows, does not resolve into a simple explanation. The return of accounts to the same locations could reflect the presence of animals that reliably use those corridors. It could reflect the perpetuation of community expectation through oral tradition. Visitors arriving at a site preloaded with the knowledge that unusual things have been reported there, and primed to interpret ambiguous experience in the light of that expectation. It could reflect the specific acoustic and visual conditions of those sites, the canyon walls that distort sound, the bluff lines that create light and shadow boundaries at dusk, the spring hollers that fill with water noise and leave only the gaps between noise for other information to travel through. Most likely it reflects some combination of all of these, distributed differently across different sites, and varying with the specific conditions of any given encounter. What it does not reflect in any straightforward way is certainty about what has been seen or heard in these places across the better part of a century of documented reports. The accounts from Steel Creek and Kyle's Landing are real accounts made by real people attending carefully to what they observed. The patterns they form when mapped across decades are real patterns, interesting to examine without requiring resolution. The landscape that produced them, the pale gravel bars of the Buffalo River in October light, the bluff face turning from orange to gray as the sun clears the ridge, the tree line at the edge of the water where anything moving through it would be visible for a moment and then not visible at all. That landscape is still there. It has not changed in any significant way from the condition that generated the first accounts in the documented record. The particular stretch of water between Steel Creek and Kyle's Landing runs whether anyone is watching it or not. The sandstone bluffs hold the last of the afternoon light for as long as the angle allows, and then go dark in the order the shadow finds them, bottom to top, the highest point of the rock holding its orange, the longest before the light leaves it entirely. The river continues under its gravel bars and through its clear October pools. The forest above the bluff rim holds whatever it holds: deer, bear, bobcat, turkey, the full and documented inventory of species known to occupy this corridor, and the forest does not annotate its contents for observers on the water below. Local residents near Alum Cove Natural Bridge describe the hollow the way they describe other features of the landscape they have known all their lives, as a place with a particular character, a quality of being the kind of place where certain things are more likely to occur than they are elsewhere. Not alarming, not extraordinary, simply a recognition that the landscape has its own tendencies, and that some places accumulate stories the way hollows accumulate fog, not because the stories are put there by design, but because the conditions that produce them are consistently present, and the stories, once generated, settle into the low places of the terrain and stay. The Buffalo River at Steel Creek in October, at the end of the afternoon, the light going out of the bluffs, top to bottom, as the shadow climbs from the water, the gravel bars pale and still, the tree line on the far bank running close to the water's edge, dense enough that the transition from open river to closed forest is immediate, a few feet of root-broken bank, and then the darkness of the canopy, interior beginning, the water moving over its gravel, quiet in the way slow water is quiet, audible but not loud, a continuous low sound that fills the gap between all the other sounds without covering any of them. And whatever the forest above the bluff holds on any particular October evening, documented, undocumented, known, or simply not yet named, the hollow continues its work of carrying sound from one place to another, across the river and up the far bank, and into the trees, at whatever pitch the source produces, and in whatever direction the canyon geometry sends it, without distinction and without resolution, the same as it has always done. Approximately 42 million years ago, the evolutionary line that would eventually produce bears and the evolutionary line that would eventually produce cats began moving in separate directions, not gradually in the way that the word separate sometimes implies, but permanently, moving apart at the level of chromosome structure, reproductive biology, and the deep cellular machinery that determines what an animal is and what it can produce. By the time the Ozark Plateau had risen and worn and settled into its current shape of karst limestone and hardwood hollow, the distance between those two lineages was older than the mountains themselves. That is the first thing the zoological record has to say about the Ozark Howler. It is not a dismissal. It is simply where the science begins, with a piece of deep time so large that it is almost easier to feel than to calculate, sitting quietly beneath everything else the investigation has to offer. There is a wildlife camera mounted on a cedar post in the Ozark National Forest. It is a standard unit, the kind used by game managers across the region to monitor white-tailed deer populations, track the movement of feral hogs, and document the occasional black bear passing through on the way to somewhere else. The camera has no opinion about what crosses its field of view. It does not distinguish between the expected and the unexpected. At 2:47 in the morning, its infrared sensor is triggered. The resulting image shows a large black bear moving through the frame at a diagonal, its head turned slightly toward the camera, its eyes catching the sensor flash as two pale discs in the darkness, wide, round, lit from within in the way that all eyes caught in artificial light look temporarily like something other than what they are. The bear is gone in the next frame. The camera records the time and continues waiting. Wildlife biologists working in Arkansas and Missouri have spent considerable time with images like this one, not because the images are mysterious, but because they are useful. They document the presence, the movement, the body condition, and the behavioral patterns of a population that has changed significantly over the past 7 decades. Black bear populations in Arkansas were severely reduced through the early 20th century. Hunting pressure and habitat loss had pushed the animals into small pockets of suitable terrain, and by mid-century, the overall population in the state had declined to a point that prompted formal management action. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission began a reintroduction program in the 1950s and 1960s, bringing animals in from Minnesota and Manitoba to supplement the diminished local population, and what followed over the subsequent decades was a recovery that wildlife managers now describe as one of the more successful large mammal reintroductions in the region's history. Current population estimates place the Arkansas black bear population above 5,000 individuals. The animals move through habitats they had not occupied in living memory. They appear on cameras, in clearings, at the edges of fields. They follow river corridors that run through some of the same terrain where howler reports have accumulated over the years. A bear, under ordinary conditions, is a recognizable thing. Its gait is known, its size is known, its coloring, for those who have seen bears in the field, falls within an expected range. What is less widely known, and what wildlife researchers have documented carefully, is the range of sounds a bear can produce when it is not behaving in its ordinary way. A bear in distress, a bear defending a food source, a bear in a breeding encounter, a bear that has been injured or cornered, can produce vocalizations that have been documented as alarming to experienced outdoors people who have heard them without context. The standard bear repertoire includes woofing, jaw-popping, and a low resonant rumble. The extended repertoire, documented in a smaller number of cases, includes wailing calls, and in circumstances researchers have described as rare but not impossible, a sustained rising vocalization that begins at a low pitch and climbs across several seconds before breaking. Field researchers and wildlife officers in Arkansas and Missouri have documented cases in which this vocalization was the initial basis for a howler report, encounters in which a witness described hearing something that seemed to them utterly unlike a bear, that produced a response in them, well out of proportion to the sounds they associated with large animals, and that on later investigation was attributed with reasonable confidence to a black bear in an unusual behavioral state. The attribution is not a verdict on the witness. It is a finding about context. What a bear sounds like in a logged-over hollow at 2 in the morning, heard from 40 yards through dense cedar, is not what a bear sounds like at a controlled observation site or in a wildlife facility. The acoustic landscape of the Ozarks does particular things to animal vocalizations. Limestone bluffs reflect sound. Hollow terrain channels it. A call that originates from one compass direction can arrive at a listener's position, appearing to come from somewhere else entirely, or from everywhere at once, or from no single identifiable source. Multiple witnesses in the Howler report describe this quality of directionlessness, specifically the sense that the sound was coming from around them rather than from a point in space. Wildlife researchers and sound engineers who have studied Ozark acoustic geography have noted that this quality is not a mystery, but it is real. It is a property of the terrain, not of any particular animal, and it affects every sound that moves through it. There is a labeled sample vial in the drawer of a university wildlife genetics lab. The vial contains a coarse, dark hair, a single collected fiber, coiled inside the glass against the wall of the container. The accompanying case sheet identifies the collection location as Newton County, Arkansas, fence barb, reported howler activity area. The collection date and the name of the person who submitted it are noted. The analysis column, entered in standard type text, reads Ursus americanus, black bear. The sample, like every hair sample, attributed to the howler in the limited number of documented cases in which DNA analysis was actually performed, has returned a result that can be assigned to a known animal. The full list of results across those documented cases includes white-tailed deer, black bear, domestic dog, and coyote. No sample in the documented record has produced an analysis result that could not be placed within a known species. That is a finding. It is not a conclusion. Hair samples collected from fence wire in areas of reported unusual activity may reflect the ordinary movement of ordinary animals, rather than the movement of whatever was reported as unusual. The sample on the wire may not be from the animal in the account. These are methodological considerations that researchers who work with physical trace evidence hold consistently, because the relationship between the evidence and the event is rarely as direct as it appears. The mountain lion presents a different and more genuinely open question. The eastern mountain lion, the subspecies that once occupied a range extending across much of the eastern United States, was officially declared extinct by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2011. The declaration came after a formal review of the evidence for living populations, a review that found no confirmed individuals, no breeding pairs, no sustained population anywhere in the eastern range. The document is a standard government record, typed in plain government typeface, with the species designation followed by its status, and the year, Puma concolor Kogwar, extinct. Beside this document, in the files of a Missouri wildlife agency, there is a note. It is handwritten, added after the fact. It references a camera trap image from 2014, an unconfirmed individual photographed moving through a Missouri county in a frame that was examined and not dismissed, but also not formally verified as representing a population rather than a dispersing animal that had traveled a very long distance from somewhere else entirely. Confirmed mountain lion sightings in Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma have increased in the 21st century. The animals have been documented by camera trap images and physical evidence, not in large numbers, not in patterns that suggest established breeding populations in those states, but as individuals moving through terrain that was once their range, following river corridors, appearing on cameras set for deer, crossing roads in front of vehicles on rural highways. The consensus among wildlife researchers is that these are dispersing individuals from the western population, young males moving east looking for territory that isn't already occupied. The eastern subspecies is gone. The western subspecies has not gone. The distance between those two facts in the specific landscape of the Ozark Plateau is where a genuine zoological uncertainty lives, separate from anything the Howler legend requires it to do. A mountain lion at full territorial vocalization is a sound that has been described by people who have heard it under controlled conditions and outside them as among the most unsettling animal sounds produced by any species currently living in North America. A large bobcat at close range produces a sound that has the same general character, a scream or an extended wail that has no analog in the acoustic vocabulary most people carry for wildlife. A wildlife researcher working in the Boston Mountains in Arkansas documented the territorial call of a large male bobcat caught in a live trap at dawn. The animal weighed 31 pounds. The researcher had full prior knowledge of the species, full familiarity with its behavioral range, and full expectation of the sound. The field notes for that morning record the vocalization as genuinely alarming, even with all of that preparation, the call filling the hollow so completely, at a volume and a pitch so far outside expectation that the response was physical rather than cognitive. The researcher's notes are careful and precise. They do not frame the moment as mysterious. They frame it as informative. A known animal under stress, in a terrain that amplifies and reflects sound, can produce a response in a trained observer that the observer explicitly notes was disproportionate to what the stimulus turned out to be. The question that follows from this is not simple. If a 31-pound bobcat can produce that response under those conditions, what would a 200-pound black bear produce? Heard from 50 yards in an Ozark hollow at 3 in the morning in a behavioral state outside the one most observers associate with bears. The question cannot be answered with certainty, but it can be held open, which is what the available evidence requires. The Ozark landscape contains animals that are documented, that are large, that are behaviorally variable, and that move through terrain designed by its own geology to do unusual things to the sounds that pass through it. The beast of Bladenboro represents a useful and well-documented case study in how these variables compound. In January 1954, in Bladenboro, North Carolina, a series of livestock killings generated reports of an unknown large predator. The described characteristics of the animal, its size, its coloring, its manner of killing, its speed, accumulated through community circulation into something considerably beyond what any single witness had actually described. The town organized hunts. Newspapers covered the story. Investigators arrived and worked through the physical evidence. Expert opinions were solicited and offered. The eventual attribution, a large bobcat, or possibly a mountain lion, an animal whose documented behavioral and physical characteristics matched the original evidence closely, did not fully displace the amplified version of the creature that had developed through the weeks of community anxiety and storytelling. The two things existed alongside each other, the zoological finding and the cultural phenomenon. The finding had failed to close. Folklorists and wildlife researchers who have written about the Bladenboro case have noted that this is not an unusual outcome. The process by which an encounter with a known animal becomes an encounter with an unknown one is well documented. It does not require deception. It does not require dramatic misperception. It requires only the ordinary accumulation of retelling, context, and the entirely human tendency to fill the space between what was seen and what it can be called with something that feels proportionate to the experience. The Ozark record contains the same pattern, documented across a longer time span and a wider geography. Physical evidence that was submitted for analysis has been assessed and assigned to known species. Vocalization accounts that were investigated have been attributed with varying degrees of confidence to bears or mountain lions or bobcats in unusual behavioral states, or to the acoustic properties of the terrain itself, or in some cases to known animals behaving normally at the full extension of their documented capacities. The wildlife biologists and researchers who have engaged with these cases in documented professional contexts have not, in the available record, described their findings as resolving every account. They have described their findings as accounting for the available physical evidence within the framework of what is currently known, which is a more precise statement and a more honest one, and one that leaves more room in it than a simple answer would. There is a plaster cast of a bear print sitting on a shelf in a Missouri wildlife office. The cast was taken from spring mud, and the edges of the print have collapsed outward in the way that spring mud collapses, slowly, under the influence of moisture moving through the substrate between the moment the track was made and the moment the plaster was poured. The print in the cast measures nearly 7 inches across. The bear's actual foot, measured separately on the same animal in a documented comparison, measured 4.5 inches. The cast sits beside a ruler in a photograph in a research file. It is a small lesson in how evidence transforms between the ground where it was made and the desk where it is analyzed, not because anyone has interfered with it, not because the measurement is dishonest, but because the world does things to evidence in transit. Mud dries. Substrate collapses outward. The print that the plaster captures is not the same object as the print that the animal made, and the difference between them is physical fact rather than interpretive error. Wildlife researchers who work with track evidence document this quality routinely. It does not mean that track evidence is useless. It means that track evidence requires interpretation, and that interpretation requires understanding what the substrate was doing, and that this understanding is the kind of careful methodological knowledge that separates a useful finding from a misleading one. The 5-toed prints attributed to the howler, documented at widths between 4 and 6 inches in soft soil, at depths consistent with an animal weighing several hundred pounds, fall within the range of variation that bear tracks in challenging substrates can produce. Wildlife biologists in documented cases have attributed these prints to black bear tracks distorted by substrate conditions. That attribution is consistent with what the evidence shows. It is not necessarily complete. The claw marks documented on tree bark and fence posts in areas of reported howler activity present a somewhat different analytical picture. Marks found at heights between 5 and 7 feet, with spacing and depth that local hunters and wildlife workers in several documented cases assessed as inconsistent with the standard reach and force of a black bear or mountain lion, are harder to place confidently within the known animal record. Some researchers have proposed that a large bear stretching upward to mark at full extension could account for the height. Others have noted that the depth and spacing of some documented marks is difficult to reconcile with that explanation. The question that emerges from these marks is not answered in the available record. It is noted, documented, and placed beside the other evidence without the resolution that would make the picture clear. What the scientific and zoological record contains, taken across its full breadth, is a set of careful but incomplete answers. The answers that have been offered are honest. The physical evidence that has been analyzed has returned results consistent with known species. The biological impossibility of a bear-cat hybrid is a settled question at the chromosomal and evolutionary level. The acoustic properties of the Ozark terrain can account for a significant portion of what witnesses describe as directionally impossible sound. Black bears in unusual behavioral states can produce vocalizations that fall well outside what most observers expect from the species. Mountain lions, or animals very much like mountain lions, are moving through the Ozarks in numbers that the official record is still catching up to. These are real things. They are documented. They are the starting point of any honest engagement with the question the howler poses. And the honest engagement requires holding one more thing alongside all of that. The witnesses in the documented record are not, in the assessed cases, describing ordinary experiences with ordinary animals. They are describing something that struck them as outside their prior range of reference, that produced in them a response disproportionate to what their prior experience had prepared them for, in terrain that does unusual things to sound and visibility, in conditions that complicate observation in ways that are themselves well documented. The zoological findings do not dismiss those accounts. They offer alternative explanations. The alternative explanations are, in the assessed cases, more parsimonious than the existence of an unknown large predator for which no biological mechanism has been identified. That is where the scientific position rests. It does not rest on certainty. It rests on the current state of what has been found, which is a different thing, and a more accurate one, and one that any careful reader of the record comes to understand as the actual condition of these cases, rather than a failure of investigation. The infrared flash of the wildlife camera, triggering at 2:47 in the morning in the Ozark National Forest, captures a bear and moves on. The camera does not record what passed through the frame an hour before the bear or an hour after. It records what it can see at the resolution it is capable of in the narrow window of its sensor's range. This is also a property of all scientific investigation, not a flaw in it, not a conspiracy within it, but a structural reality of how knowledge is produced in the field. Researchers go where funding and institutional priorities send them. Track evidence is analyzed with the tools and the methodological frameworks available. DNA from hair samples is compared against a library of known species. Camera traps capture what crosses their sensors. The Ozark Howler has not been the subject of a dedicated, sustained scientific investigation with resources comparable to what large-scale wildlife research programs deploy. The reason for that absence is institutional priority and the allocation of limited research funding, the same constraints that govern the study of dozens of other open questions in regional ecology. There is no concealment in it. There is simply the ordinary condition of science, which is that more questions exist than resources to pursue them, and the questions that persist at the margins of the record persist there because the center has other work to do. Somewhere in the file beside the 2011 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Declaration is the handwritten note referencing the 2014 Missouri camera trap image. 2 pieces of paper, one typed in standard government typeface, declaring a subspecies extinct after a formal process of review. One written by hand in the ordinary ink of a working note, acknowledging the presence of what may have been a large cat in terrain. The official record has assigned to a species that is gone. The gap between those 2 documents is not a gap the legend created. It is a gap in the scientific record itself, a real space where the documentation has not yet caught up to what the cameras are finding, where the formal declaration and the field observation have not yet been reconciled. That gap is smaller than any mystery the Howler legend requires. It is also larger than a clean answer would be. Both of those things are true, and neither of them is easy to dismiss, and the record of what is known and not yet known rests in the space between them, quiet, patient, still accumulating. The camera in the Ozark National Forest will trigger again tonight. The bear, or another bear, or something else entirely, will cross the frame or not cross it. The plaster cast on the shelf will continue to measure 7 inches across. The hair in the labeled vial will continue to read Ursus americanus. The mountain lion, documented on a Missouri camera in 2014, will remain unconfirmed in the formal sense, and the 2011 extinction declaration will remain in the record beside it. And the distance between those two facts will remain what it has been, a real distance, an honest one, the kind that the science has not yet fully traveled. The Ozark terrain will continue to do what it does with sound, carry it across limestone bluffs, channel it through hollows, bring it to a listener from no single identifiable direction. The bears will continue to produce, in their full behavioral range, sounds that fall outside what most observers carry in their prior experience of the species. The question of whether that full range of documented explanation accounts for the full range of documented report is not one the record resolves. It is one the record holds, open, careful, honest about its own edges, the way that good evidence always is when the investigation has been careful enough to show where it ends. In the Ozark Hill Country, the first trip into the forest is not treated as a casual thing. It is prepared for. There are specific items to carry, specific behaviors to observe, and specific things to know before the tree line closes behind a person for the first time. In Newton County, Arkansas, and in Shannon County, Missouri, and in the hollow communities of Searcy and Madison counties, where the ridge lines run long and the hollows between them stay dark, well into the morning, a child going into the woods for the first time, for the first deer hunt, the first foraging walk, the first morning of running trot lines on a remote creek, is told certain things before they leave the yard. Some of those things are practical. Some of those things concern the howler. Ethnographers who have conducted oral history work in these communities document the pattern with enough consistency that it begins to look less like coincidence and more like custom. The howler is not introduced to Ozark children at bedtime, and it is not introduced as a story told for its own sake. It appears at the edge of the woods, at the moment when a child is about to pass from the world of the yard and the road and the house, with its visible windows, into the world of the forest where different rules apply. The grandmother or the father or the uncle who has hunted these ridges for 40 years pauses at the tree line and says something. What is said varies by family and by county, but what it concerns does not vary much. The sound, the darkness below the bluff, and the particular quality of attention that a person in these mountains has always been expected to bring to the woods. This is where the howler lives most durably, not in newspaper reports or plaster track casts, or the formal record of what was investigated and what was concluded. Those things exist and they matter, but they are not where the legend finds its real persistence. The legend persists in the pause at the tree line, in the specific gravity of a grandparent's voice dropping low, while a child stands still and listens with the whole of their attention, the forest beginning 10 feet away and the known world ending at the back of the yard. The creature that comes up in that telling has been coming up in that same context, in that same pause at that same kind of tree line, for longer than anyone now living can fully account for. A grandmother in a Newton County kitchen in the early 1980s, sitting across a wooden table from her 8-year-old grandchild, who has just returned from a first deer hunt, tired, a little stunned by what a full morning in the November woods actually contains, tells the story of what her own father saw on the ridge above Boxley Valley the winter before she was born. Her voice is low, her hands are still on the table. The child does not move. What the grandmother is doing is not frightening the child, or not only that. She is handing the child something that was handed to her by someone who received it from someone else, a way of paying attention to the forest that carries the weight of accumulated experience through the form of a story, because that is the form the experience has always taken in these hills. The howler in that telling is not a confirmed animal. It is not a legend in the dismissive sense of that word. It is something in between, a transmitted form of attention, a shape given to the particular uncertainty that belongs to dark forest and limestone hollow, and the sound of something moving at night on the far side of the ridge. Vance Randolph, who spent decades moving through these counties with a wire recorder and an extraordinary gift for earning the trust of people who did not routinely speak to outsiders, documented something that bears directly on this. He observed that Ozark mountain people maintained a sophisticated and self-aware relationship with their own folklore traditions. They were not credulous in any simple sense. They simultaneously believed in the core truths of their stories and understood, with a kind of dry clarity, the social work those stories performed. Randolph recorded this double awareness in multiple communities and across multiple categories of legend: ghost accounts, witch tales, haint lore, creature reports, and the pattern was consistent enough that it became one of his central observations about the culture. People would tell a story with evident conviction, and then, in the same conversation, describe the story's function in terms that were almost anthropological in their precision. The Howler legend, as folklorists applying Randolph's framework have noted, sits squarely in this tradition. Longtime residents of the counties where it circulates will often discuss it with exactly this mixture: genuine conviction about something they have heard or something a trusted person described, and a wry acknowledgement that the story also does something, that it carries meaning beyond the question of whether the animal exists, and has always carried that meaning and would carry it even if the question were somehow settled. This is not a contradiction. It is a particular kind of sophistication about the relationship between experience and narrative that these communities developed over generations in close proximity to a landscape that genuinely and consistently produced experiences that were difficult to name. The newspapers in these counties in the late 19th and early 20th centuries ran the howler under different names and without any sense that they were contributing to a legend that would still be circulating 100 years later. The Harrison Daily Times, the Batesville Daily Guard, the weekly papers out of Jasper and Mountain View. Their archive pages contain items about livestock losses attributed to an unknown large predator, about sounds heard from hollow and ridge that the writers reached for language to describe and could not fully manage, about the particular quality of unease that settled over a community when something began operating in the timber that did not match the available categories. The physical descriptions in these items align closely with what later accounts would formalize as the howler's standard profile: the heavy build, the unusual movement, the sound that rose and climbed in a way that nothing in the recognized animal record quite matched. The creature in those newspaper items does not yet have the name it would later acquire, but it is doing the same explanatory work it would continue to do, giving a shape to something the community needed a shape for, locating in a single figure the accumulated unease of people living adjacent to one of the largest and most ecologically complex wild landscapes remaining in the eastern United States. The name came later, and the standardization of the physical description came with it. But the underlying experience that the legend addressed, the experience of a landscape that produced sounds and tracks and moments of genuine uncertainty that resisted easy assignment to the known, that experience was present long before anyone agreed on what to call the thing at its center. The Ozark Folk Center in Mountain View, Arkansas, opened in 1973 as a major institutional effort to preserve and transmit the material and oral culture of the Ozark region. Its programming has included instrumental music, craft traditions, foodways, and storytelling, the full range of what a living regional culture carries. Skilled Ozark storytellers performing at the Folk Center have incorporated creature legend into the repertoire with the same seriousness and craft brought to ghost stories, witch tales, and the broader category of supernatural narrative that constitutes the deepest layer of Ozark oral performance tradition. On the Folk Center's stage, a storyteller mid-account of the howler, hands moving slowly to describe the shape of something large and low at the edge of a lantern's reach, voice carrying the particular cadence of a story that has been told and refined over many retellings, is not doing something separate from the cultural preservation the institution was founded to pursue. The creature legend is part of the tradition. It has always been 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 part of the tradition. It belongs to the same imaginative and experiential world as every other story the Folk Center was built to hold. What this means for the question of the howler's reality, whether the creature exists in a zoological sense, whether the accounts describe an actual unknown animal or a known animal, misidentified, or something else entirely, is not something the Folk Center's programming answers, and not something it is meant to answer. The cultural life of a legend and the biological truth of the creature at its center are separate questions, and the Ozark storytelling tradition has never required them to be the same question. A story can be true in the ways that matter to a community without being confirmed by a plaster cast or a DNA sample or a wildlife camera image. And a plaster cast or a DNA sample or a wildlife camera image can produce a result without touching the story's truth at all. In Shannon County, Missouri, a family Bible from a farm household near the Jacks Fork River carries on its inside back cover 4 generations of handwritten notes in different inks in different hands. The oldest entry, in pencil so faded it requires direct light to read, dates from sometime in the late 19th century and records simply, "Heard it again from the East Hollow, October, same as father described." The next entry, in the slightly darker pencil of a different hand, notes a similar experience from a different season, a different direction, with the same comparative reference to what an earlier family member had reported. The third entry introduces a new detail, something about movement along the creek bank, something about the direction of the sound, and the fourth, the most recent, written in ballpoint ink in a hand that has not yet fully developed the hesitations of age, is dated 30 years after the third, and reads, "Boys heard it last night near the creek." The Bible sits in a drawer in the farmhouse. The farm is still occupied. The East Hollow is still there. What the Bible records is not evidence of the howler's existence. It is evidence of something else, a family's experience of the landscape they inhabit, understood through a specific inherited form, transmitted from one generation to the next, because the form fit the experience well enough to keep being used. The sound from the East Hollow in October is real. Whatever produces it is real. The question of what to call it has, in this family and in communities like it across the Ozark Plateau, been answered by the shape the legend provides. Not because the legend is scientifically verified, but because the legend is culturally adequate, because it gives the sound a name and a context and a relationship to the family's broader experience of the land they live on. The Buffalo River at Kyle's Landing in Newton County, Arkansas, at night in October is a particular kind of place. The river runs low in autumn, its water clear and cold over a pale gravel bed, and the sound of it moving is steady and low in the hollow without being loud enough to cover other sounds entirely. The sandstone bluffs on the far bank, orange in daylight, go pale and then gray in the falling dark, their upper faces still holding a faint luminosity, well after the forest below them has become undifferentiated black. The trees on the bluff top are visible as a dark line against a sky that holds stars better out here than in most places east of the plains. And the line between the bluff and the sky has a quality of particular clarity that is unusual for a landscape that is in most respects concerned with things being hidden rather than revealed. Down in the hollow, where the river runs and the bluffs close in on both sides, sound behaves in the way that limestone karst geography has always caused sound to behave. It moves, it reflects, it arrives from directions that do not correspond to its actual origin. It fills the hollow without quite settling into any single place. Kyle's Landing appears in Ozark Howler, accounts from the 1940s, the 1970s, the 1990s, and the early 2000s. The accounts from each era share physical and behavioral details that researchers have noted as forming one of the most consistent geographic clusters in the documented record. The river corridor between Steel Creek and Kyle's Landing is roughly 6 miles of some of the most dramatic and ecologically intact Ozark terrain accessible within the Buffalo National River Corridor, and it was already generating howler-type accounts before it became a national river designation in 1972. The people reporting experiences in this corridor across those decades were not, in the main, aware of the earlier reports from the same stretch of river. They were describing what they had encountered in a specific place, and the descriptions aligned because, whatever they were encountering, the place remained constant. This is where the howler legend and the acoustic reality of the Ozark landscape meet in a way that neither confirms nor dismisses what witnesses reported. The hollow between the bluffs at Kyle's Landing does what hollows of that geometry do. It carries sound from somewhere to somewhere else, at a volume and in a direction that can make whatever produced it seem much larger and much closer and much more inexplicable than it would seem on level ground. A black bear wading a gravel bar, a quarter-mile upstream, vocalizing in the low resonant register that researchers have documented, bears using in stress or territorial contexts would not sound like a black bear to a person standing at Kyle's Landing in the dark. It would sound like something in the trees above the bluff to the north, or something in the river behind the boat ramp to the south, or something on the far bank that the flashlight beam cannot quite reach. It would sound, in other words, like the thing the legend describes, sourceless, large, close without a clear location, and unlike anything the listener's prior experience of the known animal world has prepared them to categorize. This is not a resolution of the legend. It is not a dismissal of the accounts, it is simply a description of what the landscape does, which is itself one of the most genuinely interesting things about the Howler's geography. The terrain where the accounts cluster most densely is also the terrain where the physical conditions for exactly this kind of acoustic ambiguity are most consistently present. Whether that is a coincidence or whether it reflects the fact that the landscape's acoustic properties produce experiences that genuinely resist easy categorization, or whether something else is operating in those hollows, is a question the documented record does not answer. What the record does show, across the full range of accounts from Newton County and Shannon County and the Ouachita Hollows of LaFleur County, Oklahoma, is that the people who reported encounters with the Howler were generally doing exactly what the Ozark tradition had prepared them to do when they went into the forest, paying attention. They noticed the sound. They noted its duration and its pitch and the direction from which it seemed to come. They noted whether it changed, whether it was followed by other sounds, whether the animals in the surrounding forest went quiet after it. They noted the tracks, the claw marks on the fence post, the hair on the barbed wire, the quality of the silence that followed. They were in the specific sense that the Ozark tradition of wilderness attention had developed over 2 centuries of close habitation, with a complex and sometimes genuinely alarming landscape, doing their jobs as observers. The legend had given them a framework for the observation, and they observed carefully within it, and what they reported is what they saw and heard and found. Whether the framework is accurate, whether the creature the legend describes is the creature that produced the sounds and the tracks and the hair on the wire, is a separate question from whether the observation was real. The observation was real. The experience was real. What it was an experience of remains, as it has remained across the full span of the documented record, genuinely open. In Newton, Searcy, and Madison counties in Arkansas, and in Shannon and Carter counties in Missouri, the Ozark Howler occupies a position in community identity that is not quite like anything a person from outside these counties would encounter in their own regional culture. It is not merely a local monster story, though it functions as one in certain contexts. It is not merely a tourist attraction, though it appears on signs and in gift shops in towns that understand the commercial value of a good legend. At its deepest level, it is what folklorists have come to call a founding narrative, a story that marks membership in a place by marking knowledge of what that place contains and what it demands. To know the Howler properly, in the sense that the communities where it circulates use the word know, is to know something about the particular character of the Ozark landscape, about the relationship between human habitation and the forest that surrounds it, about the specific quality of humility that living in these hills has always required of the people who chose to live here. The creature at the center of the legend carries all of this. It has always carried more than its own weight. The storytellers at the Ozark Folk Center understand this. The grandmothers at the kitchen table understand it. The fathers who pause at the tree line before a child's first morning in the woods understand it. The legend is not a lie told about the forest. It is a truth told through a creature that may or may not exist, about a forest that most certainly does, and about the relationship between that forest and the people who have spent their lives inside it. Historical newspaper archives from rural Ozark counties carry, running through the late 19th and early 20th century, like a thread in old cloth, a recurring concern with livestock losses attributed to an unknown large predator. The items are short, specific, and written without drama. A farmer in Searcy County reports 3 sheep taken from a pasture on the ridge above his house. The kill's inconsistent with the work of a coyote or a bobcat. A note from a Newton County correspondent describes tracks in the mud along Boxley Creek that the correspondent cannot assign to any animal he knows. A brief item from Oregon County, Missouri, mentions that several families along a particular creek drainage have reported the same sound on consecutive nights, a sound the paper describes simply, with the language available to it, as like nothing heard in this country before. These items are not connected to each other by their writers, who are different people working in different counties across different decades. They are connected by the experience they are reaching for language to describe, and by the gap between that experience and the available vocabulary. The Howler, when it eventually accumulated a stable name and a standardized description, filled that gap. It gave communities scattered across 47,000 square miles of karst limestone plateau a shared form for an experience that had been circulating in pieces, unconnected and unresolved, for as long as people had been living in these hollows. This is one of the things legends do. They provide the form that experience has been asking for. Whether the experience requires a form because what produced it is genuinely unknown, or because the known thing producing it has not yet been identified, is not a question the legend answers. The legend simply provides the form and leaves the answer to the experience itself. The Ozark Plateau in October has a particular quality of light. The hardwood canopy, oak and hickory and elm, and the old-growth remnants in the steepest hollows where the timber operations did not fully reach, turns in the second and third weeks of the month, the color moving from the high ridge lines downward into the bottomlands over a period of about 2 weeks. And during that period, the quality of light in the hollows shifts in a way that is difficult to describe to someone who has not spent time in this specific landscape. The light comes in differently through a canopy that is partly thinned, and it falls on forest floor and creek bank and limestone bluff, face in a way that gives the landscape a quality of being just slightly more visible than it usually is, as if the forest has briefly lowered whatever it ordinarily keeps between itself and the observer. The gravel bars on the Buffalo River in October catch afternoon light and hold it longer than they seem to in summer. The bluffs along the current river reflect the turned canopy color back down into the hollows in the early morning. The whole plateau for those 2 weeks seems slightly more present to itself, slightly less concealed. It is in this light, in October, that the most frequently cited howler accounts are set. Not all of them, in the seasonal distribution of the reported encounters, is not perfectly consistent, but October appears in the clustering more than any other month, and people who know these counties well would not find that surprising. October is when people are in the woods. It is the beginning of deer season, and the beginning of the foraging season for certain roots and late mushrooms, and it is the month when the weather breaks from the summer's weight and the forest becomes easier to move through. October is when the relationship between the Ozark Hills and the people who live in them is most actively renewed after the long semi-withdrawal of summer's heat. It is when the first trip into the woods that begins the transmission of the legend most commonly occurs. It is when the grandparents tell the children what the forest contains. It is in the acoustic and sensory reality of the landscape, when the conditions for exactly the kind of encounter the legend describes are most reliably present. Cool air that carries sound farther, fallen leaves that amplify footfalls, a canopy thinned enough to make the darkness between the trees less total and therefore paradoxically more suggestive. The legend and the landscape it belongs to have shaped each other across a long time. The legend has given the landscape's ambiguities a name, and the landscape has kept providing the ambiguities that make the name feel necessary. This is not evidence for or against the howler's existence as a zoological entity. It is a description of how a particular kind of place and a particular kind of story have been in conversation with each other for as long as there have been people in the hollows to hold that conversation. What remains at the end of the documented record is not a tidy conclusion. The track cast from Newton County and the DNA samples from fence barbs and the wildlife camera images from the Ozark National Forest and the official vocalization recordings submitted to university wildlife programs, all of these have produced results that either assign the physical evidence to known species or produce results that are inconclusive without being definitively strange. No piece of physical evidence in the documented howler record has returned a result that formal science could not account for. This is a fact, and it is worth holding clearly. It does not resolve the question of what witnesses heard from the East Hollow in October, or what moved across the gravel road at Leslie in 1973, or what left the claw marks on the fence post at shoulder height in a Newton County pasture. The physical evidence record and the witness account record are not the same record, and they do not always speak to each other. What science has found at the sites of howler reports is a landscape fully capable of producing encounters that resist easy categorization. Black bears under stress produce vocalizations that documented researchers have described as genuinely alarming, even with full prior knowledge of the species. Mountain lions, whose official eastern extinction was declared in 2011, while camera trap images of dispersing western individuals were accumulating in Missouri and Arkansas files, move through terrain with a speed and silence that experienced woodsmen have described as something they were not fully prepared for, even after years of study. The acoustic properties of limestone karst hollow and sandstone bluff carry sound in ways that make locating a source difficult, even for experienced observers. The forest between Steel Creek and Kyle's Landing is dense enough and old enough and large enough that a person moving through it for the first time has very little framework for interpreting what they hear. This is the Ozark landscape operating as it has always operated, providing the conditions for experience that is real and specific and genuinely difficult to name. The legend is the community's long accumulated response to that experience. It is not the only possible response, and it may not be the correct one in the scientific sense of that word, but it is the response that has persisted, that has been handed from grandmother to grandchild at the edge of the tree line across enough generations that it has become part of what the tree line means, part of the instruction set for how to move through a landscape that has never been fully legible to the people who love it most. The Buffalo River at Kyle's Landing runs quiet in October. The water is low, and the sound of it moving over the gravel is a steady, even presence in the hollow, low enough that other sounds carry above it without effort. The sandstone bluffs above the far bank have gone from their afternoon orange to a pale gray in the falling light, and the tree line above them is dark now, against a sky that still holds some color in the west. The limestone karst beneath the plateau continues its slow, geologically patient work of moving water through the rock, and the hollow between the bluffs holds the last of the daylight a few minutes longer than the ridgeline above it, and then releases it. And whatever has ever been in this hollow, bear or lion or something else, something the available taxonomy has not yet found a category for, or simply the darkness between the trees and the river, moving over its gravel bed, and the acoustic geometry of limestone walls, carrying a known sound from somewhere unexpected, is not visible from the landing now. The forest above the bluff is a single dark shape against the remaining sky. The river continues. The hollow continues to do what hollows do, carry sound from one place to another, at a pitch and in a direction that makes the source difficult to locate, difficult to name, and easy in the particular darkness of an October night in the Ozark Hill Country to believe in. The story has been passing through these hollows for a very long time. In the kitchen on the Newton County farm, and at the edge of the tree line before the first morning's hunt, and on the stage at Mountain View, and in the faded pencil of the Bible entry from the East Hollow, and in the careful, neat columns of the field researcher's notebook, where the margin notation reads, "Cannot assign to known species with confidence." In all of these places, and through all of these hands, something is being transmitted. Whether what is being transmitted is a record of an actual unknown animal or a form given to the genuine ambiguity of a genuinely ambiguous landscape, or both of these things held together without requiring resolution, the transmission continues. The river at Kyle's Landing keeps moving over its gravel bed through the October dark, the same river it was when the first account was written, the same hollow, the same bluffs, the same acoustic geography carrying whatever sounds the night contains, from one bank to the other and back again. The forest above the bluff stands as it has stood for longer than the legend, and will stand in all probability longer than any single account of what has ever moved through it. The hollow goes quiet in the way that hollows go quiet when the last of the light leaves, and the temperature drops, and the animals that have been moving at dusk settle into whatever stillness the night requires of them. The river runs on,